Hi. Good, I'm on. Thank you. Thank you for being here. We are going to be talking about getting from stories to action, insights at scale. I'm very happy to be here. And what we're really thinking about today is a framework that helps us think about and use data in ways that can help you get more strategic in your work. So this is the first time I was ever on stage. This was 20 years ago. This was me as a sort of suburban poet. I thought I was a beatnik. This was with a good friend of mine. We were performing a piece that we'd written together. And I just loved stories. I loved writing stories. I loved reading stories. And it's interesting because stories are really how I got here today. Because one thing I learned about stories is that to make stories come to life, to make them affect change, to help you make choices, you start to bring in data, right? And data makes stories more powerful. So first we're going to talk about talking to humans. So, learning stories from others, is essential to how we learn and building empathy and understanding context. This is all through having conversations, having a sense of the world, getting a sense of empathy for others. This is the foundation of what we call design research. So hold your hand up if you know the term design research, if you've heard this before. Great. So lots of folks in the audience. So, design research is the study of people and their issues and needs and behaviors, and this is done with a purpose, right? It's done to inspire and to inform a design process. So these are all photos from design research fieldwork that I've done over the years, and each one of these really encapsulates something, right? It's like a moment for someone in their life, something that's meaningful, and it might look simple, but each one holds something complex, right? It's a new behavior. It's something that drives insight about a way that someone's interacting with the world in new ways. And each one of these pictures is from a study that was done, with a client to drive insights forward to make strategic choices about what we do and the people that we're designing for. And each one of these started with what we call a jumpstart question, right? So this is the phrase or way of thinking that really catalyzes what you're doing. It inspires what you're doing, and it starts you on your process. I'm going to go through an example of how this works together. So at the New York Times, we have a global audience, actually, and we're thinking a lot about how we grow our global audience. I've been working on a project to think about how we grow our global audience in Latin America. And we're starting in Mexico. And we're thinking a lot about how people read news in Mexico, how they use it, how it matters to them in their lives. And we were recently in Mexico City doing field work, understanding people and how they're reading news and how news matters to them. So we were talking both to news readers as well as to news experts. And one thing that we were particularly interested in is how people read news when they commute. As New Yorkers, right, reading news on our commute is really important. You look around on the subway and everyone has their phone out. Everyone's reading something on their phone. We were curious, does this hold true? For people in Mexico City, is this a thing that happens? Is this a thing we should be designing for? And what we saw is no, right? We went on a commute with one of our research participants, and we were riding on the bus with him, and we were looking around. No one had their phone out. And we talked to folks and asked them, why? Why? I mean, people have smartphones there, but it's a safety issue. It's a security issue. You don't just take your phone out on the bus. That's not something that you do. So now as we're thinking about how we are making strategic choices, as we're thinking about how we design for this audience, we know this now, right? It's something that we can start to think about how we build news tools for this audience and when they might be reading news and when they might not be. So we started with this jumpstart question of what can we learn from how people in Mexico City are getting news. We had this moment of empathy and observation where we spent 2 weeks learning from people. And we learned about, in this particular thing, that there's a lot of mobile phone usage, but not a lot of this is happening during what we were seeing during this commute moment. And then we had this hypothesis, right, that maybe people in Mexico City have overall lower news app usage during this time. So we went from this question to empathy and observation to building a hypothesis, and this helped us get really deep. We could understand what are people really doing and needing, and what does this mean for them. But then, you sort of reach a moment where you think, is this behavior that we saw indicative of a broader phenomenon, right? Were we on the one bus in Mexico City where no one reads the news, right? Can we extrapolate from what we've seen to a broader population? And that's where we start thinking about going broad, right? We want to learn from more people. And when we think about learning from more people, that's when we're thinking about data, right? Like that's how that starts to come in. And one thing that you've been hearing today so far is about how data represents people, right? You can think of one data point as encapsulating like a moment in time for a person and a choice and what that means for them. And you start looking at across hundreds, thousands, millions of people, and suddenly that's a lot of choices, that's a lot of behavior, and you can start to see a bigger picture. So then you can start to test your hypothesis, right? Does this hold up? Does this hold up for everyone always, or for some people some of the time, or for people like right now, right? You can start to put some like shape and substance around what we start to like develop as our hypothesis. So we essentially go from, going very deep in this deep understanding to a broad understanding, and that gives us confidence. So let me talk about this word confidence and what we mean here. So I don't mean like self-esteem, right? Like, it's not how you feel about yourself. And it's also not statistical confidence, which is a very specific concept. You can think of it as more like organizational confidence, right? Like, do we believe in our assertions? Can we rally our team behind what we've learned? And can we move forward with what we've learned? Let's talk a bit about what we mean when we learn from data, right? So first of all, like what is it, right? Like what are we actually talking about when we talk about data? And one way of thinking about this is that it's information in numerical form that we can use to spot patterns. And it comes from somewhere, right? Like someone made a choice to collect something, and now we have it, right? So your two choices, you can use existing data, you can make your own data, right? Like these are the ways that you get data. So let's talk about what we mean by existing data. So some sources you can get for data, like you have sales data, you have syndicated data. This is particularly important in media. Web analytics, like if you're working on a digital product, like someone's probably collecting this already. And then there's creating data, right? You create data when you want to answer a question that no one's asked before, right? It's a new question, and so you need new data to answer this new question. And some ways of thinking about this could be running Facebook tests, right? Put a paid post and see how people engage with it. This could mean getting like really much more specific and more targeted with how you do web analytics. So this is called in-page analytics from Google, and it's a nice tool when you want to like drill down to something very particular. And there's also running surveys, and you can like write very good surveys, and you can also write really bad surveys. I'm sure you've seen some bad ones. Don't do that. So, by going deep and going broad, we really bring it all together, right? And by using data through whether it's existing or data that you've created, that really helps you build out this full story. And now we get to this point where we like figure out what this means, right? This is analysis and synthesis. So analysis means we're looking for patterns and we're looking for change, right? And synthesis is how do we build on like different kinds of data, and what does the story mean altogether? So analysis can be really complicated. It can also be really, really simple. It can be as simple as highlight some cells in Excel and hit the little button that says Make Chart. You really can start there, and that will be useful to you because you can start to visualize things that can help like drive some inquiry, right? Like why is that thing at the top biggest, right? And why is this other thing at the bottom smallest? Like, why is that, right? Like, we can start to think about that. Or like, what happened here, right? Like, why is no one doing this thing anymore? And then that can start to be kind of juicy, like once you start really thinking about what you're seeing. And then it gets really interesting when you start synthesizing, right? Like when you're bringing together your analysis with what you learn from people, and that starts to tell one story. So then you can understand more about why do people like this thing at the top more than this other thing? Or why is this thing at the bottom? Why has that stayed at the bottom but has stayed on the list for so long? You start knowing the why, right? The why comes in when you start learning from people. And from here, this could be like, well, what are people doing instead, right? This chart dropped off a lot, so there's something people aren't doing anymore, but what's replaced that behavior? That's the kind of thing you can get through your qualitative research. So let's talk about how stories and data can help you take smart action through a case study. So I've done this kind of work for many organizations, many clients over the years, and one of my favorite stories to share, not only because I can share it, and most of my work is confidential, but it's also a really fun story. And this was for, it's called OpenIDEO. So I don't know if anyone here, raise your hand if you've heard of OpenIDEO. Great. So it's an offshoot of IDEO, which is a design studio. And OpenIDEO is essentially an online community for people to come together and solve design challenges together. Anyone can join. It's like Wikipedia in that way. Like anyone who wants to can hop on and contribute. But a couple years ago, the community was at a moment where they were thinking like, the leaders of OpenIDEO were asking, how do we re-engage parts of our community? How do we think about rebuilding our platform? What's our way forward? So I helped them think through this, right, and really understanding the audience. And our jumpstart question here, the place where we began this particular work, was what do people care about when it comes to OpenIDEO? For people within the community, like what does it mean to them? And what do they do with this? And this was the time for us to really go deep. Here is when we did empathy and observation, right? So in this particular study, we used remote research techniques to talk to people all around the world. So we talked to 6 people who were at really different levels of engagement with their OpenIDEO journey, right? So some people were like avid users and were contributing all the time. And other people, came on for one particular challenge and then they just kind of drifted away. We wanted to understand both of those experiences and talk to them about what they'd been through. And what we knew from these conversations was that, for one thing, professional development was a big issue. People mattered for people's professional lives in a way we hadn't expected. And another thing was this. This woman who we talked to in New Zealand said, I decided to carve out some time and do this in person with other people. So she was working on OpenIDEO with friends. Right? We would not have captured this through any kind of data analysis of our site because this wasn't happening on our site, right? This is why this was so interesting to us. It was a behavior that we hadn't heard of before that was novel to us. And we thought maybe this is a way to re-engage some people in the community who maybe aren't as engaged now. So we sort of kept that in the back of our minds, right? Like the study wasn't about this, but this emerged during this early stage of research and we thought, okay, noted. Let's keep tracing that through and see if this hypothesis holds up. Does this speak to a broader community? Like, is this a phenomenon, or is it this one person doing this one thing? So we developed, a few hypotheses, right? This was very rich research, and we didn't want to just go in learning one thing, but really a few things. And one was, maybe there's something around engagement that people who aren't as engaged aren't getting something important from the site. And so what is that missing factor? Like, what is that piece and what can we learn about that? But then also maybe working on challenges in person could be important. Like maybe that's something we explore. Maybe that's something we prototype. And if so, how do we think about prototyping it, right? How do we start shaping that? So now we're in a moment where we start to go broad. And the first thing we did was to work with some existing data because we had it. Right? It doesn't make sense to start kind of creating your own data if there's something you can already look at, because you'll be smarter about asking the right questions when you make your data if you already know what you know, if that makes sense, right? So what we had already was what we called action data. So these were things that people had done on the site that recorded as actions on the back end of the platform. So these were things like I commented on a concept, I submitted my own concept, I hit the little button that said applaud, which is sort of like. So we had all of that behavior, recorded behavior for every member of the community since the beginning of when we started. And we started to see some patterns, right? We saw patterns around like people getting really deeply involved and then fading away. We saw other people who, stayed consistent over time. So there's some things that we got out of that, but there was a lot we didn't get out of that. And so that's the moment where we turn to making our own data and thinking about, like, what do we collect? What makes sense for us? And that's when we wrote a survey, right? For the whole website, we wanted to know, what do people want? What do they need? And what are they doing when they're not on the site, right? There's no other way we could have understood this in a broad context rather than doing this. So we learned a lot from this, right? We saw that that people who had stopped using it, like sometimes it was because they actually just wanted to work at IDEO and then they didn't get the job, and so then they never came back. And so that was really interesting for us from like an HR perspective. Like we wouldn't have known that. But then as we dove in deeper, like more insights started to come out. And this was when we got really deep into the analysis and synthesis process. So we basically had 3 different layers of data here, right? We had our community interviews with these people who we got to know kind of well. We had our behavioral data of what everyone had been doing, but was actually like kind of shallow. And then we had the sort of midpoint of the survey data, which really sits between the two in terms of scale, right? But this was 659 people who completed the survey. So it was much bigger than we could have talked to in person. It was smaller than we got from the action data, but it really filled in this kind of sweet spot for how we were able to make sense of the overall landscape of what was happening. So right off the bat, super easy, the equivalent of like clicking on a cell and say make chart. 80% of the survey respondents said that they had been talking about open IDEO challenges with their friends and with their colleagues. And so they were doing this kind of what we called off-platform engagement to varying degrees. And we thought, well, that's big, right? There is something here, right? We were able to test this and see that this is, in fact, representative of a broader phenomenon. But then we were also able to get a little deeper than this. So I know these words are pretty tiny for you. They don't really matter, right? The story here is that we ask this question, looking forward, what do you most hope to see from open IDEO? So this is a question about what they want in terms of impact. And why we ask this question is what we learned from the initial qualitative work is that impact really matters to people. That's what gets them engaged, and that's what keeps them engaged if they feel like their work is having the right kind of impact. So doing that initial work helped us know that, okay, this is the question to ask that's really going to help define the audience. And we saw that a lot of people were putting a lot of weight on this first question. Open IDEO generates new ideas that spread through the world outside the open IDEO community. And basically how we asked this question was through a series of forced choice questions, which, not to get too deep into it, it used maximum difference scaling to help people basically allocate preference across items. So for statistics nerds, that's how we did it, right? Which gives you very rich information about preference. But then we were wondering, like, this is a really important question. What about all this other stuff? Like, what are people who allocated preference on these other items? Like, what do we know about them, and how do they matter for us? So we did what's called two-step cluster analysis based on this question, but looking across our data in general. And we saw that the community was kind of splitting out across 4 buckets, or what we call clusters, right? And sure enough, this first thing, open IDEO generates new ideas that spread through the world, there is a segment of people for whom that's really, really important. So you can see that big dark red square up there. Basically, whenever they're given a choice, do you want this thing or do you want the spreading ideas throughout the world? They're like, yes, spreading ideas throughout the world. That's the thing that really matters to them. But there are these other people for whom other stuff matters more, right? That the challenge sponsor brings the winning ideas to life. That I take what I learned from open IDEO to make positive changes in my local community. The challenge topic aligns with my interests and passions. So now we have these 4 groups, right? Instead of looking at the audience as this kind of monolithic whole, we can start seeing, well, what if we have 4 audiences, right? And as we were able to bring in this data all together, because remember, we know all these people, right? We have their ID numbers in the system, so we're able to trace them from survey responses to action data, and for some of them, the conversations as well. So then we're able to see patterns emerge for people in each cluster, what they're actually doing, and not just what they're saying they're wanting. Bringing all that together, we could then really look at these in a more strategic way and start to think about addressing each one by one. In this one segment, the broadcaster was interesting for us. I'll use that as an example because it's the largest cluster. But these people are actually the least engaged on the site. and they're also the ones who are the ones selecting that thing on the top bar, right? So if we'd only stopped after doing that initial analysis saying, oh, well, people really want this one thing, we would have ignored the rest of the community who are the ones who are actually submitting concepts and building things forward. We would have only been designing for the relatively passive part of the audience. So you see how this starts to get to a point where you can make some really interesting choices that you couldn't have gotten from just any one of those data sets on its own. So what came out of this is that OpenIDEO started doing more meetups, right? It started as a pretty small effort, building out a meetup toolkit, and now there are OpenIDEO meetups all over the world, and this has become a really central part of what they do as a way of engaging an audience and thinking about how do we really bring this to people in a way that's meaningful. And we would have never gotten here if we'd only looked at the data that we had around behavior, right? We would have not known to ask this question. We would have not known to push forward with our hypothesis and go from there. So this is a nice example of moving from conversation to data to action, which is really the core. If we stop at conversation, we probably had a nice time. Fieldwork is really fun, right? I enjoy it. But if you never get to a point where you make a choice, then it doesn't really do much for you, So let's talk about how we get started, how this begins. How are we on time? Okay. So essentially, you have two choices. You can learn, and you can collaborate. Lots of ways to go about learning statistical tools. I'm not going to get into that here. But I really want to talk about collaboration, right? This is my colleague Dale. He's a data scientist. We sit across from each other at the New York Times. And it's so cool that literally we sit across from each other. 2 years ago, that wouldn't have happened, right? Because the organization is starting to think about how we build cross-functional teams. And that makes all of this much better, right? Because I think the best way to learn is to collaborate. And another data scientist who I work with, I asked her for advice. I said, listen, I'm going to be talking to a lot of designers about data. What would you want to tell them? And she said, listen, I know working with data scientists can be a little intimidating, but we are not scary, actually. And then she said another thing, which was bring me a hypothesis. Get some clarity around what you're asking for, right? That quants are like scientists, and we want to figure it out. And this is a very good way to start a conversation, to say, here's this thing that might be relevant and meaningful and indicative of a bigger thing. Can you help me figure it out? So not only is this way of bringing together stories and data useful for making choices, but it also is good for relationships, right? It's good for organizations as you get to know more people and start to build stronger organizations and stronger teams, as well as making better choices. So thank you.